they don't make the grade, believe me, they will not get the aid. And I will continue to challenge the aid system to ensure that international rules remain relevant to our changing world. As Hurricane Irma graphically demonstrated, they need to be flexible so that aid gets to the right place at the right time. That equally applies to British citizens in our British territories. In today's world of new threats and extremist ideologies, and I'm not just talking about Mr. Corbyn, we must be bold and unapologetic for standing up for our values. Conservatives do not talk Britain down. We are the party that raises horizons, transforms lives, and secures a better future. We know that trade, investment, and free markets provide the route out of poverty. And as we look to support prosperity in developing countries and growth in the UK, Brexit is the opportunity to secure our place in the world. Britain can reassert itself as a global beacon for free trade, free enterprise, and free markets. Earlier this year, I launched DFID's first ever economic development strategy and set out a vision for how the private sector can boost jobs, growth, and development. Now, my objective is clear. I'm not here to endlessly hand out money. I will help people and countries to stand on their own 2 feet. Like Mary in Ethiopia, who now works full-time in the new industrial zone in Hawassa. Thanks to DFID, she can now provide for her family. And also millions of girls around the world who are now able to go to school. And the job of everyone working in development must be to end aid dependency. We're offering a hand up, not a handout. And that is why I'm working with colleagues across government to promote economic development. In Nigeria, we're working to create real jobs and tackle the scourge of modern-day slavery. Our trade department is creating new trading links in some of the poorest countries in the world. I want the countries who receive aid today to be our trading partners of the future. And we made a clear commitment on aid in our manifesto, and we will honour it. The money I have saved from closing programmes is now going on projects such as the fight against neglected tropical diseases. We will deliver over 1 billion treatments to fight cruel, avoidable infections such as trachoma, guinea worm, and river blindness. Britain is leading the way on clearing landmines globally. And I'm placing a new international emphasis on improving the lives of people with disability. And that's not all. Across the country, there have been thousands of small charities led by inspirational people doing amazing work around the world. But for years, they have found it impossible to access UK aid because the aid budget supported big international charities. That is why I'm opening up the aid budget to the best of British charities up and down the country, using British values and expertise to shape a better world. This Conservative government is leading the way in eradicating polio from the face of this earth forever. And I want to pay tribute to the thousands of Rotarians across the world, and also in this audience as well, who have led the fight against polio. Earlier this year, the world faced a terrifying prospect of 4 famines. We succeeded in getting the rest of the world to pull their weight, and it was global Britain that raised the alarm and pushed the international community to step up and deliver a life-saving response. That saved millions of lives, and I will continue to challenge others to do more. Compare that with Labour's approach to the world. Last week at their conference, Mr. Corbyn failed to condemn North Korea for abusing human rights and flouting international rules by launching missiles. He failed to condemn Venezuela, where the regime that he has held up as a beacon for others to follow is viciously stamping out all opposition. He failed to condemn the terror his friends in Hamas have unleashed upon the Israeli people. And not once did he condemn or confront his supporters who have launched a wave of anti-Semitism, bullying and abuse against anyone who does not subscribe to their extremist views. And as he stood in Brighton, of all places, he once again failed to apologise for standing side by side with the IRA terrorists who brutally murdered and maimed. Disgraceful. Our approach is different from Labour because our values are different from Labour's. They believe that wealth is created by governments and bureaucracy. We believe that wealth is created by people and enterprise. I believe in people, markets and freedom. This is what will genuinely serve the interests of the many and not the few. The Labour Party, despite what they say, does not stand for the many. It stands for the vested, narrow interests of the few, the dogmatic few, exploiting the hopes and fears of young people, only to go on and lie to them, celebrating the state-sponsored theft of property held by private citizens. And when it comes to international relations, they have just one principle: to turn a blind eye and refuse to speak out as their socialist friends and comrades unleash violence and repression against people and communities. Shame on them, shame on the Labour Party, and shame on their vile brand of socialism. It is our responsibility to stop them from getting anywhere near the door of number 10. They are not fit to represent Britain or the British people. That is why what you do is so important. And from me, and from all my colleagues in Cabinet and Parliament, I want to say a huge thank you, because it's your hard work and campaigning that made all the difference. You have delivered us the highest Conservative vote for many years, some 13.6 million people who backed us at the ballot box. So we know what we need to do. We must set out the positive case for Conservative values across all areas of policy. Explain why our ideas will create the society that we all want to see and live in, not just for us, for our children and for their children. One which is open and tolerant and extends opportunity for all. British Conservative values are my values, and I will use them to shape a better country and a better world for all. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
The defence of the realm is the first duty of government, and a Conservative government will take that responsibility very seriously always. We have the finest armed forces in the world. Pretty just described them as heroic, and they deserve our full support and the very best resources. With a Conservative government, the United Kingdom has the biggest defence budget in Europe. We're continuing to meet the NATO 2% target for defence spending, and we will continue to increase defence spending in real terms every year of this Parliament. We'll now hear from the Secretary of State for Defence. Please welcome Michael Fallon.
Thank you for that most generous welcome. And let me repeat my thanks to my team, Freddie Howe, Mark Lancaster, Harriet Baldwin, Tobias Elwood, Oliver Dowden, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Andrew Griffiths and Annabel Gold. This week we set out our plans for a global Britain that stands up for our people and for our values. This city needs no reminding of the threats from extremists who want to destroy our way of life. When I became Defence Secretary 3 years ago, Daesh terrorists were at the gates of Baghdad, beheading British hostages, throwing gay people off buildings, enslaving women. And when the democratic government of Iraq appealed for help, Britain answered that call. At our conference 3 years ago, I announced the first successful RAF airstrike. As of last night, there have been 1,600 airstrikes. The Army has trained 60,000 Iraqi troops. The Royal Navy has been guarding the United States carriers in the Gulf. Daesh is being defeated. The black flags have been torn down. 3 million people have been freed from its murderous rule. So we should be very proud of the contribution of our armed forces to this success, and I'm delighted to tell you that a new medal will be awarded to those servicemen and women who are doing so much to fight the evil of our time. Conference, terrorism is not the only threat to our security. Russian aggression, with the highest level of submarine activity since the Cold War, thousands of troops exercising on NATO's borders. North Korea, firing ballistic missiles over Japan, cyber attacks on our own National Health Service and on our Parliament. So we are stepping up our response. Today, our armed forces are on operations in more than 25 countries. Conference, they're helping to stop Afghanistan become a haven for terrorists. They're training Ukraine's armed forces to defend themselves against Russian aggression. They're down in Nigeria, helping to tackle terrorists, and they're supporting United Nations peacekeeping in Somalia and South Sudan. And we are leading in NATO. Our army deploying in Estonia and Poland, RAF Typhoons protecting the Black Sea skies, and the Royal Navy leading NATO's maritime task groups. And our armed forces are also ready for anything. Look at the response to the most powerful hurricane ever to hit the Caribbean. RFA Mounts Bay was already on station to provide immediate assistance, helping our people, the people of the British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos. Within a week, we had deployed 600 service personnel, 3 helicopters, and 1 foreign secretary. We even flew French supplies from Normandy to Guadeloupe. From Asia Pacific to the Middle East to Europe, we are deepening our defence ties with our allies and partners. And Conference, we have no greater ally than the United States of America. In defence, Secretary Jim Mattis, we have a true friend of our nation with whom I work closely on Russia, on North Korea, on the campaign against Daesh. And here at home too, our armed forces are patrolling our skies and seas every hour of every day. Every one of them deserves our gratitude. Conference, there is no better statement to the world of our ambition for Britain than our 2 new aircraft carriers. This is the lion that really roars. Weighing 65,000 tons, the Queen Elizabeth provides 4 acres of sovereign territory deployable around the globe to serve on operations for the next 50 years. Made in Britain, built in 6 shipyards, assembled in Scotland, these carriers are a tribute to British engineering, British technology, British skills, the pride of our nation. And yes, there will be planes on them. We already have 12 F-35 jets with 120 ground crew and pilots training up in the United States before the first squadron arrives in RAF Marham next summer. And what does Jeremy Corbyn have to say in response? He asked, and I quote, "Why do we have to be able to have planes, transport aircraft, aircraft carriers, and everything else to get anywhere in the world?" Well, you don't get very far without them. He wants, Mr. Corbyn, to slash defence spending. He wouldn't authorise drone strikes on terrorists. He would abandon our NATO allies. We must never put the security of our country in the hands of a man whose warped worldview puts him on the side of those who threaten us. We are backing up. We are backing up our global ambition with the 5th biggest defence budget in the world. £35 billion last year, £36 billion this year, £37 billion next year. A budget that our manifesto has committed to increasing by at least 0.5% above inflation in every year of this Parliament. Now, of course, you'll always find retired generals or admirals who'd like even more. But what matters, Conference, isn't just numbers. It's power, stronger, smarter defence. We're now investing £18 billion a year in new equipment. And by the way, 18 billion really is 350 million a week. In the last 3 years, we've started building 7 new ships and submarines for the Royal Navy. Now, I want to see more of our ships out there patrolling the 7 seas. So today, Conference, I'm announcing 800 million of support contracts that will produce faster turnaround and improve the availability of our world-class warships. The Army is getting new attack helicopters and new armoured vehicles built in Wales. The RAF, 16 new transport aircraft have already joined our fleet, and 9 maritime patrol aircraft will start arriving in Lossiemouth. And under Theresa May's leadership, we are also renewing our nuclear deterrent, building 4 Dreadnought-class submarines. North Korea's illegal testing underlines just how irresponsible it would be to scrap the deterrent that protects us. It's all very well Jeremy Corbyn saying he would never use nuclear weapons. But, Conference, Manchester and London are closer to Pyongyang than Los Angeles. Being prepared in the most extreme of circumstances to use nuclear weapons is what separates a Prime Minister from a pacifist. Now, as we grow our defence budget, we must continue to modernise the way that we work, to modernise how we equip our armed forces, everything from ration packs to medical kit. We will make savings of some £600 million, improving how we run our test and training sites. We'll deliver another 300 million of further savings. And as those threats to our country intensify, we are now looking right across government to make sure that we are doing enough, spending enough, to properly protect our country against all of those threats: cyber, hybrid warfare, rogue states, terrorist attacks. Spending 2% of GDP on defence is the minimum NATO commitment. We meet it, but we should always aim to do better still. Now, one of the great privileges of being Defence Secretary is meeting the outstanding people who make up our armed forces. Many of them started as cadets. This morning, I visited Albion Academy in Salford, one of 150 new cadet units we have already set up. Those cadet units are instilling values of resolve and service, discipline and loyalty, from which we can all learn. So today I am announcing the creation of a further 30 new cadet units in state schools. I also want to attract into our armed forces more ethnic minority and female recruits. I set a target of 10% of recruits in future to come from a black, Asian or minority ethnic background by 2020. We're at 7% at the moment. And they're joining some who've already reached the ranks of Brigadier, Commodore and Air Commodore. We're also on track to meet our target that 15% of new recruits should be female. But I want to do even better. So I'm opening up every single role in the armed forces to women, so that talent, not gender, determines how far you can go. And I will expect the next Chief of the Defence Staff, whoever he or she may be, to champion more diversity in the leadership of our armed forces. I will also lead a new Ministerial Covenant and Veterans Board to look after our armed servicemen and women better when they leave. Often the worst scars are the ones that we can't see. So we must deliver mental health services better tailored for our veterans. Conference, I'm tackling some other injustices too. Thanks to our evidence, thousands of false legal claims against our armed forces have been dismissed. The leading solicitor involved has been struck off, and I've shut down the Iraq Historic Allegations Tribunal. And I'm working with James Brokenshire to make sure that investigations into killings during the Troubles in Northern Ireland focus on terrorists, not on those who protected our people. Conference, under this government, we will go on increasing defence spending. Our magnificent armed forces will go on keeping us safe. But as citizens of a truly global Britain, we have a wider, deeper responsibility. We must defend our values too. Britain, this great country, stands as a beacon to the world for our commitment to freedom, democracy, tolerance, and the rule of law. We face terrorism and aggression from those who hate us, not because those values are losing, but because they're winning, because they're values that have lifted millions around the globe out of oppression and poverty. With the 5th biggest defence budget in the world, we have the means. So we must always be ready to answer that call from further away, from fragile democracies, from the very poorest, from the hardest hit. That means deploying our ships, our planes, and yes, our troops on the ground, where we and our allies are asked to help. Standing up for what we believe in, standing up for global Britain. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Britain has always been a global nation, playing an active, leading role in the world, advancing the interests of the British people and defending our values. We have one of the most extensive diplomatic networks in the world. We're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a leading member of NATO, and a strong voice in the Commonwealth. We are, without a doubt, a voice for good in the world. It's now my pleasure to introduce our Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Please welcome to the stage Boris Johnson.
Conference, thank you. Good afternoon. As our hearts go out to Las Vegas today, we're reminded again of the attack that took place here in this city only a few months ago on innocent and music-loving young people. And if there is a message to our American friends, it is this: that they will come through it and they will come back stronger. Because this city has shown that nothing and no one can bow the indomitable spirit of the people of Manchester. A city which in recent years has reinvented itself as the great thrumming engine of the Northern powerhouse, with its vast potential to generate jobs in finance, in academia, in journalism, the arts, and that's just the ones held by my old friend, George Osborne. And since our subject this afternoon is how to win the future and build global Britain, I want to introduce our superb Foreign Office team, our PPSs, Connor Burns, Amanda Milling, our Whip, David Evanet, our ministers covering the Middle East, already one of the most expert parliamentarians in that field, Alistair Burt, covering Africa, Rory Stewart. Thank you for that applause for these great men. And like the pharaohs of Upper and Lower Egypt, they are double-hatted ministers in the sense that they simultaneously represent the FCO and DFID, bringing together our foreign policy and our aid programmes. In the Lords, we have Tariq Ahmad, who is working to ensure that next year in London we make the most, at last, of an institution that takes 2.4 billion people, 52 of some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and unites them in admiration of the service provided by Her Majesty the Queen, the Commonwealth. And we will have a Commonwealth Summit to do her justice. Just back from Burma, I think, making clear this country's disgust at the treatment of the Rohingya, Mark Field, and dynamically triangulating between Europe and America, decoding President Trump to President Juncker, and vice versa. We have that Mount Rushmore of wisdom, Sir Alan Duncan. We have a great team and we are getting on with the job. And yet, frankly, folks, as I absorb the general tone of the national conversation, I don't think I have ever known so many to be sunk in gloom and dubitation about Britain and the world. Every week, I pick up a fine British edited international news magazine of the kind that you'll find in the briefcases of jet-setting consultants, glossy, covered, elegantly written, suspiciously unread. Every week, these publications have found new reasons to be slightly less than cheerful about this country. Every day, a distinguished pink newspaper manages to make Eeyore look positively exuberant. And across the world, it pains me to say it, across the world, the impression is being given that this country is not up to it, that we're going to bottle out of Brexit and end up in some dingy anteroom of the EU, pathetically waiting for the scraps, but no longer in control of the menu. And the most pessimistic of them all is not the media or our friends in the EU Commission or the excitable Monsieur Guy Verhofstadt. Far from it, it's Jeremy Corbyn, that NATO-bashing, trident-scrapping would-be abolisher of the British Army, whose first instinct, in the event of almost any international outrage or disaster, is to upend the analysis until he can find a way of blaming British foreign policy, and whose response to the grisly events in Venezuela is to side with the regime simply because they are fellow lefties. He says he still admires Bolivarian revolutionary socialism. I say he's Caracas. And it's beyond satire. It's beyond satire. At a time when the world should unite to condemn Venezuela's Maduro, we have the leader of Britain's official opposition giving cover to a government that is jailing opponents, shooting demonstrators, intimidating journalists, and repressing human rights. It is a disgrace. And I can tell you, there are many Labour MPs who feel appalled that their party is still led by this man, with his peculiar belief expressed in glutinous victory-style rallies up and down the country that he somehow won the election. He didn't win. You won. We won. 56 seats ahead. Theresa May won. She won more votes than any party leader and took this party to its highest share of the vote in any election in the last 25 years. And the whole country owes her a debt for her steadfastness in taking Britain forward, as she will, to a great Brexit deal based on that Florence speech, on whose every syllable, I can tell you, the whole cabinet is united. And of all... And of all the areas where Corbyn is content to talk this country down, there is none more ludicrous and vacillating than his policy on Brexit. In the customs union 1 week, out the next, in the single market, out the next, in, out, faster than one of those members of the shadow cabinet who gets sacked before she knows she's even been appointed. A kind of manifestation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It would be disastrous if that negotiating strategy were put into practice. And in leaving Britain in limbo, locked in the orbit of the EU, but unable to take back control, unable to do proper free trade deals, Labour would inflict a national humiliation on us on a par with going cap in hand to the IMF. And yes, I know when you talk about the IMF in the 1970s, I'm aware that we come up against a difficulty. We must accept that we imagine that people immediately understand about power cuts, about the 3-day week union bosses back in Downing Street, state-made British rail sandwiches. We think people get the reference. But unfortunately, going back to the 1970s sounds to too many people like a massive joint revival concert by David Bowie, Led Zepp, and the Rolling Stones. And that is because people can't remember the Stones and Bowie, Led Zepp, monuments of our global culture, actually fled these islands not led them, fled them. Might have been even more better if they'd led them, frankly. Fled these islands. They fled these islands, along with so many other wealth creators, because they were driven overseas by Labour's 83% tax rate. And people have forgotten today that we used to worry about the brain drain, not people wanting to come here. And they've forgotten that we, Conservatives, had to fight and win the battle of ideas. And in a way, it's entirely forgivable and understandable that that amnesia has descended, because our victory has been so comprehensive. If you go around the world as I do and you listen to the aspirations of young people, you'll find not a single successful global economy that would dream of implementing the semi-Marxist agenda of McDonnell and Corbyn. And wherever you find enterprise and innovation and economic growth, it's because people have followed our ideas that were pioneered by our party, and in this country, by the way, in this city of Manchester. And from India to China to Thailand, Vietnam, where free markets, deregulation have been put into practice, they have helped to lift more people out of poverty faster than at any time in history. Go to the Central and East European economies. This party, not the Labour Party, helped on the path to democracy and freedom, and you'll see it in Estonia, a tech hub with a high degree of social protection. They have a flat tax of 20%. Romania, they have a flat tax of 16%, of free health and education and free higher education. Hungary, they have a tax rate of 15%. We're all low tax Conservatives, but even I think 15% is going in a bit. How crazy, therefore, a quarter of a century after the working people of those former Soviet bloc countries risked their lives to throw off the shackles of socialism, while the Labour left sneered at them and made excuses for their oppressors, the shadow leader and shadow chancellor are seriously proposing to place the British people back in bondage, a £200 billion renationalisation programme, a display of economic masochism that would do incalculable damage to the future of our children. And that's the difference between this Conservative Party and the Labour Party. We want a country with a government that works for everyone. Corbyn wants a Britain where everyone works for the government. And this battle of ideas is not lost in memories of the 1970s. It is back from the grave, its zombie fingers straining for the levers of power. And that is why we cannot rest. And we may have the most illustrious battle honours of any political party in the world. But now we have to win the battle for the future. And the way to win the future is not to attack the market economy, not to junk our gains, but to make it work better. Make it work better for the low paid, turning the living wage under this Conservative government into a national living wage. Make it work for all those who worry their kids will never find a home to own by building hundreds of thousands of homes, as we are, far more than Labour ever did. Make it work better for parents who can't find good enough childcare. 30 hours of free childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds every week. And above all, help people who are struggling by driving the benefit reforms that have helped millions back into the dignity and self-esteem that goes with a job, and which has seen inequality not rise, but fall, as Philip Hammond rightly said yesterday, to the lowest levels for 3 decades. And to win the future, we must communicate once again our great central idea of one nation conservatism. That for all its faults, an open, free trading and thriving market economy is the only sustainable way to create the wealth we will always need to help the poorest. The surest way to finance the platform of great public services and great infrastructure that themselves enable business to succeed. And the only way to win the future is not to retreat from the world, not to abandon globalization, but to play our part, as we always have, in making the world safer and freer and therefore more prosperous. And that is why we must believe in global Britain, not dismiss the very notion of a world role, as Jeremy Corbyn does, but accentuate and be proud of that role. There are places where it is simply our moral duty to British passport holders, like the overseas territories in the Caribbean, whose islands have been overwhelmed by the biggest catastrophe for 150 years. It's an eerie scene, not a leaf remaining on the shattered trees, houses turned into streaks of plastic and wooden litter, boats hurled on top of one another or lodged absurdly up hillsides. Of all the disasters I've seen in my lifetime, none has overturned the lives of so many UK nationals. And yet we should pay tribute to the unconquerable resilience of those islanders. And British islanders, by the way. And together with Priti Patel and Michael Fallon, this government will work to put them back on their feet. And of course, our responsibilities go still wider. When we protect the world, we protect British interests. When we campaign for the stability of the South China Seas, that is because through that narrow, pulsing jugular of the Malacca Straits, only 1.7 miles wide, goes fully 25% of world trade, including huge quantities of British goods. Across the Middle East and North Africa, we are helping to bring peace and defeat terrorism, not just because that is right in itself, but because these will be the great markets of the coming century. Just in the last few weeks, I've seen British troops training the Nigerian forces to defeat the numbskulls of Boko Haram around Maiduguri, where British doctors are tending the maimed victims of terror. And as our helicopter swooped over the burned and deserted villages, they said there was a risk of potshots from behind. And I said that was an occupational hazard in my line of work. And every week with UK help, the brave Nigerian forces are winning. But you can't just tackle the problem in Nigeria. Those terrorists, AK-47s, are being smuggled down through the desert from the chaos in Libya. And so in Tripoli, I've seen the charred ruins of our embassy, a smashed snooker table, the room where Tony Blair once held a banquet. But I was proud to run that Union Jack back up the flagpole. And that embassy is being rebuilt, with or without the snooker table. And if we in Libya, if we in the UK can help solve the problems in Libya, and we're making progress in Libya, then that country can also win a great future. And until we do, you will find British ships off the Libyan coast helping our Italian friends to cope with illegal migration. And that is what I mean by global Britain. That's what Priti and Michael and I mean. Committed as team players and, when necessary, as leaders to the protection of the world and our common European home. I've just seen 800 British troops in Estonia and congratulated them on resisting the honey traps allegedly placed in their way by Russian intelligence. At least they said they'd resisted. They are a visible and powerful symbol of this country's unconditional commitment to defend the boundaries of Europe and the freedoms we won in the 1980s and 1990s. And I can't tell you how much our friends value Britain's contribution in Europe and around the world, because I think we've reached a unique phase in our history. We are big enough to do amazing things. We have the ability to project force 7,000 miles overseas, to use our permanent membership of the UN Security Council to mobilize a collective response to the crisis in North Korea. We contribute, as Priti was just saying, 25% of European aid spending. We're the leaders. And yet no one seriously complains that we're bullies or that we have a sinister national agenda. And that's why the phrase global Britain makes sense, because if you said global Russia or global China or even, alas, global America, it would not have quite the same flavour. And I'm not saying that everyone automatically loves us all the time, or that everyone completely follows our sense of humour, though a lot more do than you might think, by the way. But there is a huge desire out there for us to engage with the world more emphatically than ever before. And after Brexit, that is what our friends and partners are going to get, as this country is freed from endlessly trying to block things in Brussels committee rooms, freed to stop being negative and to start being positive about what we believe in, including free trade. You see my friend Michael leading the clap there. And yes, we are leaving the EU. But as the Prime Minister has said in her Florence speech, we can create a deep and special partnership built on free trade, with a strong EU, buttressed and supported by a strong UK. And since it is manifestly absurd to argue that European values or culture or civilization are somehow defined or delimited by the institutions of the EU, we will be no less European. Britain will continue to be European in culture, geography, art, history, architecture, spiritually, morally, probably. You name it. We are one of the great quintessential European nations, in many ways the most influential European nation of all. And that is because our most important exports are our values. British values, embodied not just here in this amazing metropolis of Manchester or in London, but across the country. A society that welcomes talent, that welcomed my ancestors from France and Russia and Turkey and heaven knows where, I'm sure my father could advise me, that is proud of the EU nationals and the other nationals that want to come here, that have enriched our lives. A society that doesn't judge you for where you come from or your background, or how you live your life, provided you do no harm to others. And that is the syncretic genius of our country. And it's thanks to that intellectual cross-fertilisation that Britain is at the cutting edge of new markets and new technology. Think back to how the world has changed in our lifetimes. And then think forward. Let's somebody take a film of me with a camera there. Think how crazy that would have seemed 40 years ago. It seems pretty crazy now, but think forward to what we can achieve in your lifetime, William Hague's lifetime. You've still got a long way to go. We will eventually crack global warming with British clean technology and British green finance, in which we lead the world, and we will get to a point where we can generate as much clean energy as we want. And eventually, we will stabilise our world populations, we will raise per capita GDP, and I'll tell you how, above all, by promoting female education. Which is at the heart of all British overseas policy. And we should be proud, you should all be proud, of the young women and girls that we are helping to teach around the world. As Priti has said, in Africa, in South Asia, 6 million of them in the Punjab in Pakistan alone. And if we can drive on with our friends that great cause of female empowerment and education, the Swiss Army knife that solves so many problems, then I believe we will eventually find a cure for the psychological contamination of radical Islamist extremism. Just as we eradicated smallpox and polio, it came and it will go. And of course, we will have problems. Humanity is always going to have problems of afflictions in mind or body, because without pain and doubt and anxiety, there can be no pleasure and no triumph and no success. But success will not be achieved by allowing the UK to retreat from our global role, but by reinforcing that role. And breakthroughs will not come through the edict of some Corbynist bureaucrat in some ministry of plenty, but through the effort of inventors and scientists and business people and students and dreamers, of whom we have so many. And to all those who are really worried about the UK today, Let me remind you, it was only 8 years ago that we stood on the verge of the nastiest and deepest recession for 70 years. And I remember being taken up onto the roof of City Hall, which I then ran, by a female American TV journalist. And she rather took the wind out of my sails by saying, "Mr. Mayor, look around you." This was in 2008. Things weren't looking good. She said, "No one is building anything in your city." And she was right. All the cranes were down because confidence had gone, deserted us. All I can say is look at London today, storming ahead. Even if the new mayor isn't a patch on the last guy, by the way. He seems to spend... He seems to spend his time rather ineffectually trying to ban things. Why can't he do something for a change? And then look at us. Look at the United Kingdom. The lowest unemployment rate for 42 years. The highest number of people in work ever. The #1 destination for investment into Europe. And every time one of these facts emerges, it is reported in tones of slight disappointment. And with the inevitable qualification, despite Brexit. It is time to stop treating the referendum result as though it were a plague of boils or a murrain on our cattle or an inexplicable aberration by 17.4 million people. It is time to be bold, to seize the opportunities. And there is no country better placed than Britain, which is not only the place where the atom was first split, but which has become a gigantic cyclotron of talent in which people are coming together from every discipline to produce constant flashes of inspiration. Indeed, we are consistently rated the global capital of innovation. We export more TV programs than any other country in Europe, 5 times more than the French, hélas. I think that's permitted in the laws of diplomacy. We export a program to Cambodia. A program to Cambodia called Nik Neng Kle Che Sethe, which means, who wants to be a millionaire? And it is thanks to the triumph of conservative values that you are allowed to become a millionaire in Cambodia these days without being dispatched for re-education by some Asiatic John McDonnell. We lead the world. We lead the world in bioscience and fintech and many other techs and some branches of artificial intelligence, cybernetics. What's Labour's first... What was Corbyn's first response on hearing the news that we lead the world in cybernetics? He wants to tax robots. Make them join the union. I ask you, did Manchester become great? Did Manchester become great by taxing the spinning jenny? We have a growing space program run by my brother Joe Johnson. And I have a candidate, my friends, for the first man we gently blast into orbit. And that is the superannuated space cadet from Islington. And I know he has an innocent and vol-trousered air, but his domestic policies, Jeremy Corbyn's domestic policies, would rack up debt that our children and grandchildren would be unable to pay. And his foreign policies would imperil not just this country, but our friends and our neighbours as well. Conference, we cannot allow it to happen. 200 years ago, people used to come to this city to see something revolutionary, the beginning of the modern world. And once again, this country has had the guts to try to do something new and different, to challenge received wisdom with a democratic revolution that we can turn into a cultural and technological and commercial renaissance. There are people who say we can't do it. We say we can. We can win the future because we are the party that believes in this country and we believe in the potential of the British people. we Conservatives have been privileged, collectively, to be placed in charge of this amazing country at a critical moment in our history. We are not the lion. We do not claim, like some others, to be the lion. That role is played by the people of this country. But it is up to us now, in the traditional, non-threatening, and genial, self-deprecating way of the British, to let that lion roar. Thank you very much.